Viking myths that turned out to be true. Let's start with the most iconic one, the image that is literally the symbol of Vikings in pop culture, the horned helmet. You've seen it everywhere, in movies, in cartoons, on Halloween costumes at Party City, a massive bearded Viking in a helmet with horns. This image is so deeply baked in that when I tell people the truth, they look at me the same way they'd look at someone who just told them Santa Claus isn't real. The truth, Vikings never wore horned helmets in battle. Not once. Ever. Hold on, let me explain. Out of all the archaeological finds connected to Vikings, and there are thousands, with excavations going back 2 centuries, exactly 2 helmets have been found with anything resembling horns. 2, and both date not to the Viking Age, but to the Bronze Age, roughly 1,000 years before Vikings even showed up on the historical stage. They were probably used in religious ceremonies, not in battle. The actual combat helmets archaeologists have found are simple, conical metal helmets, sometimes with a nose guard. Practical, no horns, because horns in real combat are a disaster. Think about it. You're in a shield wall, your buddies are right next to you, and everybody's got 2 horns sticking out of their head. You can't turn your head without hitting someone. Your enemy can grab a horn and rip your helmet off. The horn catches on your neighbor's shield. It's not badass, it's a functional nightmare. So where did the myth come from? And here's where the story gets genuinely interesting. One man is responsible, or more precisely, one artist. Karl Emil Doppler, a German costume designer in the 19th century. In 1876, he was designing costumes for the first staging of Richard Wagner's opera Der Ring der Nibelungen, The Ring of the Nibelung, an opera about Germanic and Norse mythology. He needed to make the characters look visually striking and barbarically exotic for a Victorian audience. He drew helmets with horns. The opera was a sensation. The image spread across Europe and America. Artists started painting Vikings with horned helmets. Textbook illustrators copied the look. Hollywood ran with it. And 150 years later, we're all convinced it's historical fact. One artist, one opera, a century and a half of mass delusion. But you know what's the funniest part? The Scandinavians themselves, the actual descendants of Vikings, modern Norwegians, Swedes, Danes, they know perfectly well this is a myth. They laugh about it. Scandinavian museums have exhibits specifically dedicated to debunking the horned helmet. It's basically their national joke about how the rest of the world understands their ancestors. The horned helmet is a costume from a 19th century opera that became accepted historical fact in the minds of half the human race. If that's not a lesson in how pop culture works, I don't know what is. Vikings Barbarians. Okay, we've handled the helmets. Now let's talk about a myth that goes to the heart of what Vikings actually did. The raiding and the violence. Because the image of a Viking in pop culture is literally show up, kill people, burn things, sail away, rinse and repeat. And here's where reality diverges from myth in a direction that might actually surprise you. The myth goes like this. Vikings were exclusively warriors and raiders. Raiding was their main occupation. It's what they lived for. Reality. The vast majority of people we call Vikings were farmers, merchants, fishermen, and craftsmen. Warriors made up a relatively small portion of the population. And even they didn't spend all their time raiding. The raiding season was in the summer. And the rest of the year they were farming like everyone else. Viking trade routes were one of the most extensive commercial networks in the early medieval world. They traded with the Byzantine Empire. With the Arab Caliphate, archaeologists have found Scandinavian artifacts in Baghdad. They reached Newfoundland in Canada, 500 years before Columbus. The settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows has been excavated and dated. It's a real 11th century Scandinavian settlement in North America. Dublin, Ireland, was founded by Vikings as a trading post. Kiev was established by Scandinavian merchants known as the Varangians. The ruling Rurik dynasty that founded the Russian state was of Scandinavian origin. This is not the image of a wild pillager burning down monasteries. This is the image of an entrepreneur opening up new markets. Sometimes, yes, by violent means, but it's a fundamentally different picture. Now, for the most disturbing myth in this category, the blood eagle. If you've watched the show Vikings, you know the scene. A ritual execution where the victim's back is cut open, the ribs are spread apart, and the lungs are pulled out to look like wings. While the person is still alive, it's described in several Norse sagas. These are real texts. The question is it describing an actual practice, or is it a literary device? Historians are still arguing about this. Some believe the blood eagle was a real ritual execution. Others think it was a poetic metaphor that later scribes took literally. Medical analysis shows that the procedure described in the sagas is anatomically possible, but the victim would have lost consciousness from pain shock well before it was completed. That means either the Norse had knowledge of anesthesia, which seems unlikely, or the description is an artistic exaggeration, or it's an entirely invented ritual that the Scandinavians themselves cultivated to terrify their enemies. Being so terrifying that your enemies surrender without a fight is also a strategy. Berserks. Okay, berserkers. This is the topic I've been looking forward to since the beginning, because here reality is, in some ways, crazier than the myth. The myth: berserkers were elite warriors who entered a battle rage, lost the ability to feel pain, and fought like wild animals. The sagas describe them howling, biting their shields, virtually unstoppable in combat. Reality: berserkers were real. This is not a myth. They are documented historical figures. And here's where it gets really interesting. What exactly caused their state? Theory 1, fly agaric mushrooms. Amanita muscaria, a mushroom that contains psychoactive compounds. It's a beautiful theory. The problem, there's no direct historical evidence that berserkers actually consumed them. Theory 2, a psychological technique of battle trance. Ritual movements, roaring, self-hypnosis before a fight. Adrenaline in sufficient quantities genuinely changes how you experience pain and fear. No mushrooms required. Theory 3, the most unexpected. Berserkers may have suffered from a hereditary neurological disorder. The sagas describe the ability to be a berserker as something passed down through certain families, which supports a genetic hypothesis. The creepiest detail that almost never gets mentioned. In peacetime, berserkers were a social problem. The sagas describe cases where a berserker would enter the state without any combat context, just randomly in the village, at dinner. By the 11th century, in some Scandinavian legal codes, berserkery had been criminalized. The Vikings themselves outlawed berserkers by law because they were too dangerous even for Viking society. That's a level of storytelling that movies haven't even gotten to yet. Lightning sword. The next myth, and I want you to picture something for a second. A blacksmith, a small forge somewhere in 9th century Scandinavia. He's holding a piece of metal that fell from the sky. Literally, fell from the sky, left a trail of fire, slammed into the ground, and just sat there until someone found it. The metal is cold, heavy, with a pattern on its surface that exists in no earthly iron. The blacksmith has never heard the word meteorite. All he knows is one thing: this metal isn't from here, it came from above, from the gods, and he starts forging a sword. This sounds like the opening scene of a fantasy movie, like the origin story of a legendary artifact from God of War or Skyrim, like a myth somebody made up because it sounded cool. reality. This actually happened. And we know it happened because we found the weapons. Let's start with the basics. Meteoric iron is iron that literally fell from space. Iron-nickel meteorites hit Earth on a regular basis. And here's what makes them special from a metallurgy standpoint. They're already an alloy, a natural one. Iron mixed with nickel in ratios that earthly blacksmiths couldn't replicate because the raw materials available to them had almost no nickel in them. Nickel in steel does several things at once. It increases hardness. It increases toughness, meaning the metal is both hard and not brittle, which in a blade is absolutely critical. And it provides corrosion resistance. A blade made from meteoric iron rusts dramatically slower than regular iron. For a 9th century blacksmith who spent his life working with bog iron full of impurities, meteoric metal was, by every measure, magic. It cut better, it held an edge longer, it didn't rust the way ordinary iron did, and it had a pattern on its surface, the Widmanstätten pattern, a crystalline structure visible to the naked eye that exists in no metal found on Earth. This pattern only forms in the conditions of outer space. Millions of years of slow cooling in a vacuum. It cannot be reproduced on Earth. Wrong temperature gradient, wrong cooling rate. Literally impossible. Even today, a blacksmith holding a piece of meteoric iron could see that pattern. Metal from the heavens. Metal with a design that doesn't exist anywhere in the earthly world. Metal that, once forged, cuts better than anything he's ever made. What conclusion is he supposed to reach? The obvious one. The gods sent this metal. A weapon made from it carries something beyond human. This isn't superstition. It's the only rational interpretation when astrophysics doesn't exist yet as a field of knowledge. Now, where's the proof this was actually happening? The most famous example, the dagger found in Tutankhamun's tomb in Egypt. When scientists analyzed it in 2016, it turned out to be meteoric, 3,000 years BC. The Egyptians called meteoric iron metal from the sky and reserved it for the highest status ritual objects. But we're here for the Scandinavians, and this is where it gets to a discovery most people have never heard of. Several Scandinavian artifacts, when put through spectral analysis, showed a composition characteristic of meteoric iron, elevated nickel content that simply cannot come from any earthly raw material available in Scandinavia during that period. And critically, this analysis was done on objects found in high-status burials, meaning meteoric metal was being used to make things for the elite. Not for the rank and file warrior, for the chieftain, for the person whose status demanded a weapon that was, in the most literal sense, not of this world. Scandinavia isn't a particularly meteor-rich region, but it's loaded with bogs and peat deposits where meteorites preserve exceptionally well, and the Scandinavians were trading across all of Eurasia. Meteoric metal could have been coming in from the east, through Varangian trade routes, from the steppes where meteorite strikes were recorded far more frequently. This explains something that's puzzled historians for a long time. Why do some Scandinavian blades, when analyzed, show a composition that doesn't match any known iron ore source in the region? The metal came from somewhere else, and one explanation is that it came, quite literally, from above. But here's the final detail that makes this story feel genuinely cinematic. In Norse mythology, Mjolnir, Thor's hammer, was forged by the dwarves Sindri and Brokkr in underground smithies from a special metal. It returned to its owner's hand after being thrown. It could destroy anything. It was a weapon beyond human craft. Mjolnir literally means lightning or crusher. And here's the question I can't shake. What if the original Mjolnir, not as a specific object but as an archetype, a template, was a real weapon made from meteoric metal that someone found, forged, and that cut and held up so well it seemed superhuman? Metal that fell from the sky like lightning. That left a trail of fire on the way down. That, after forging, outperformed everything made by human hands. That carried a pattern found nowhere in the earthly world. This isn't proof, it's a hypothesis. But it's a hypothesis built on the real physics of a real metal found in real burials. A sword forged from lightning isn't some bard story around a campfire. It's an attempt to explain in the language of myth what a blacksmith saw with his own hands and had no other way to describe. The metal came from the sky. The weapon made from it was the best he'd ever seen. So the gods must have sent it. Vikings are pagans. Final section. And I saved this one for last because it's the most unexpected. And because it dismantles one of the most persistent images, not just about Vikings, but about the Middle Ages in general. The myth. Vikings were savage pagans who stood in complete opposition to Christian civilization. The church versus the barbarians. Light versus darkness. Monks in monasteries versus the people burning those monasteries down. Reality is far stranger and messier, and it plays out through one specific story that is perhaps the wildest example of cultural adaptation in medieval history. Rollo, a Norse chieftain, late 9th, early 10th century. He'd been raiding what is now France for years. The King of France, Charles III, known to history as Charles the Simple, which already tells you something, in 911 made a decision that looks completely insane. He gave Rollo a massive chunk of northern France in exchange for stopping the raids and defending the land against other Vikings. The territory gets the name Normandy, from Northmen. Rollo accepts the deal, gets baptized, marries a French princess, starts governing French territory. His descendants over the next 150 years become so thoroughly French that in 1066, Rollo's great-great-grandson, William the Conqueror, invades England and brings with him the French language, French culture, and French aristocracy. Wait. Let that sink in. A Viking who raided France gets a piece of France. His descendants become French aristocrats. They conquer England. The English language is permanently changed because the ruling class speaks French. About a third of the modern English vocabulary is of French origin. Words like government, justice, noble, castle, army, all French. They entered English through the Norman conquest, which only happened because one French king decided to buy off one Viking with a chunk of real estate. Admit it, it was cool, or just weird. Either way, you're still here. You know the rules. Like, subscribe, and leave a comment saying I'm a genius, or a complete mess. See you in the next madness. Stay with me.